Hi, and welcome to the show where we share the stories of the many who intersect with our healthcare system but are rarely heard from. My name is Kevin Poe, founder and editor of KevinMD. Rate and review the show at kevinmd.com/rate. Subscribe at kevinmd.com/podcast. Today, we welcome back on the show, Chris Kager. He's a neurosurgeon, and his latest KevinMD article, which we'll talk about today, is titled The Inflation Reduction Act. Can it build back medicine better and reduce climate change? Chris, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So for those who didn't get a chance to listen to our first episode, and we were talking about it like almost 2 years ago, right? Just briefly share your story and journey to where you are today.
Sure. So I'm actually a full-time clinical neurosurgeon, but over the last 10 years, I became interested in investing and private equity, ended up joining an angel investment group and learning a lot more about investing and venture capital. And then about 3.5, almost 4 years ago, I became a partner in a venture capital fund, Global Health Impact Fund out of California, that is focused mainly on medical technology and digital health. During pandemic, I also completed an MBA to give me a little more baseline knowledge. And I still look for companies, even outside of our fund, that are interesting companies and impact companies. So I ended up becoming connected with a company in the sort of renewable energy and hydrogen space that we'll touch on.
For those who are interested in moving into that venture capital space, I know there are a lot of doctors, especially over the last few years during the pandemic, they realize that clinical medicine isn't as secure as it used to be and they want to branch out. What kind of advice do you have for them?
Read all you can, learn all you can, and get some experience. So it's very hard, I think, to transition from a full-time clinical physician directly into venture capital. But there are venture capital and funds and other investment vehicles that are looking for people that have clinical experience, also with some type of business background. So you can learn a lot just by reading, going on different platforms. Some people ask, is it necessary that I get an MBA? And although I don't think it's necessary, I think for me, it provided me with some baseline level of financial knowledge.
So let's talk about the most recent act that was passed, the Inflation Reduction Act. I know has wide-reaching consequences. You ask, can it build back medicine better and reduce climate change in your most recent KevinMD article? So walk my audience through it and share the story why you decided to write it.
Sure. First of all, like a lot of things that are done in Washington, it's a fairly complicated bill. There's a lot of areas that it touches on. So I wanted to, for my own edification, read through the summary. I did not read all 750 pages of the bill, but I really wanted to focus on two things that for me impact us the most, and me in particular with regards to green energy. But also, interestingly, the name of it is somewhat misleading, Inflation Reduction Act, but there are some very specific impacts in medicine. And this has to go back to a year ago when they were talking about passing the Build Back Better Act, and some of those same clauses were in that original bill that did not pass. So anyway, I wanted to take a look and just give an overview of what those items would be for in medicine and then as well as clean energy.
All right, so let's go into more detail. So tell us, how does the Inflation Reduction Act, how does that affect clinicians and medicine?
The first thing is there is some debate whether it's actually going to help inflation, but there are some economists that believe that the long-term effects of this will actually reduce inflation and set us on a better pathway with regards to these other issues. First of all, for the medical field, this bill, bipartisan calculations have come up with a number. They believe it's going to save Medicare about $288 billion over the next 10 years. So that, from a system effect alone, is quite a good start. Then when you get into the pieces of how it affects patients and physicians, one of the provisions in the bill is that it caps out-of-pocket prescription expenses for Medicare individuals to $2,000 a year.
Now, what are the specific ways? How does it go about saving Medicare that amount of money?
So we'll get into that. That's some of these other items that come up for discussion. That was just the overview number, is that all these clauses will save about $288 billion. So in the bill itself, there's actually a provision that Medicare is then required to negotiate the costs of prescription medications. And they're very specific about what they require, and it'll affect probably about 20 plus of the most commonly and highest cost medications to Medicare. The other part of that is that the drug companies are somewhat capped and what they can charge Medicare to no higher raise than the rate of inflation. And if it raises faster than that, then they're required to give essentially a rebate back. So that alone is a big chunk of this as far as how it's going to save the Medicare system that much money. And then there's some thought that this will spill over into commercial and private payers as well. Then there's actually a provision in this that will help increase access. So I don't know if you knew that there were some plans on the Affordable Care Act marketplace that were basically set to expire. And for the next 3 years, it will actually expand access by keeping those subsidies in place as well.
So in terms of the impact that these cost savings have, how many years do you think it'll be before we notice it, just me and a patient in the exam room?
So most of these provisions phase in over the next couple of years. The cap will be, I believe, as early as 2024. So it'll be relatively, it won't be tomorrow, but it'll be over the next year or two. And as far as these other things, they all phase in over a 10-year time period.
And from your perspective, having a toe in both the medical and the financial world, what's your take on these changes on our healthcare system?
I mean, I think in general, it was a good direction. It wasn't quite as all-encompassing as the Build Back Better Act was, which was actually a $2 trillion bill that was originally floated back at the end of 2021. But I think it may have more of an effect on an individual patient and perhaps less of an effect on the system, but still a relatively good start, especially for those patients that require a fairly extensive number of prescriptions.
So you mentioned, as you were talking about this act, that there's a question of whether, if in fact, it will reduce inflation. Why is that?
If you're looking at the bill as a whole, you're not talking about a huge amount of money for the overall government, but there's also some spending provisions on this as well. So you're talking about cutting prescription costs, that's great, but then you're also using some of that money to expand access and keep the Affordable Care Act in place. So it's a little bit of a taking money from one spot to pay for the other. But we're just talking right now, we were just talking about the medical provisions. There's a thought that some of the investments that they're going to make in other areas may actually spur growth and spur the economy to reduce the costs that they're using to spur that.
So one of the other major areas of this act, of course, is its impact on climate change. So talk more about that.
So I think we're living in a great time. This is actually the largest single piece of legislation ever passed to try to reduce or reverse climate change. This goes back all the way to the early 2000s with the Paris meetings and the Paris Accord. So there is a thought that this act in general will reduce the U.S. greenhouse gas production. So that everything's earmarked or compared to 2005, because that's when the first agreements were in place. So between 2005 and 2030, a 25-year time period, with what was already in place, they predicted only a 20 to 25% overall reduction in greenhouse gas production. And this single piece of legislation, they think, pushes that to over a 40% total reduction in greenhouse gases. So pretty impactful if all turns out to work as planned. There are some specific provisions that are fairly deeply buried in these, but there's a provision for tax credits to switch to clean energy. So that includes up to a $7,500 credit for electric vehicle purchase. And there are some interesting provisions even within that part of this that it has to be manufactured or assembled in the United States. So there's already been some debate about the total number of electric vehicles that actually would qualify under this bill. And then there's incentives for commercial buildings. It's actually a two-pronged approach. So there's mandates and then there's incentives for commercial buildings to switch over to more clean or green energy as well. And then there's a total of $369 billion available for climate change initiatives, including carbon capture, which is becoming a bit more popular to be discussed, and also green hydrogen production. And that includes, for green hydrogen companies, up to a $3 per kilogram production credit for green hydrogen.
You mentioned that the Inflation Reduction Act didn't get everything that was initially proposed in the Build Back Better Act. So when it comes to climate change, what didn't get included?
I'm not aware of anything that they didn't include. At least I think that the scope of the bill was very similar. It was more a matter of the amount of funding that they had for the bill.
And in our current political climate, where it's very difficult to get anything passed, just in your opinion, do you think that the Inflation Reduction Act, was it the best that could have been done in this current political climate?
I'm shocked it got passed, and it required a lot of maneuvering and negotiation to do it. And it basically came down to two senators, Senator Manchin and Senator Sinema, that got it done basically at midnight. So I don't know if it was the best, but I think it was close to what we could expect, and it was really a one-vote decision.
Now let's go back to its effect on clinicians in the healthcare system. Do any of the effects from this act, does it telegraph a roadmap going forward in terms of further impacts that can happen to our healthcare system?
So you said it's very polarized, and I would agree with that. Although there's definitely enough support for this movement, I don't think it signals anything specific, but I think it does signal that there's at least a initiative to be a little bit more liberal on spending when it comes to healthcare. So I don't think it's going to telegraph any one specific movement. Like, for example, zero chance that this is telegraphing a single payer system. I get what you're saying, and I think that there's some leeway as things become a bit more progressive.
Now, you mentioned one possibility when it comes to Medicare negotiating drug prices, that can spread to the private payers as well. What's your thoughts on the chance of something like that happening?
I think that the private payers are always looking for a chance to reduce their payments. And at least in my world as a surgeon, anytime Medicare reduces a payment, the private payers are lining up behind themselves to do the same. So I think it's really only a matter of time until there's some movement on the private side to do that as well.
We're talking to Chris Kager. He is a neurosurgeon, and his KevinMD article, which we're talking about today, is the Inflation Reduction Act. Can it build back medicine better and reduce climate change? Chris, if you were in charge of the United States government when it comes to healthcare and climate change, in your ideal world, what would you like to see as the immediate next steps?
I think even as a surgeon, I think a bit more of an emphasis on primary care and illness prevention is where you get probably a higher impact for your investments. I don't think that my generation is probably a little older, but I don't think the current generation of clinicians coming through are against the single payer system. And I think in the right case and in the right format, I think people have some concern about having the government design that and implement that. But I think that a single payer system could help eliminate a lot of the cost and a lot of bureaucracy, hopefully without creating more bureaucracy, because the administrative cost in medicine is huge. As far as clean or renewable energy, that's a bit tougher because I think that's a bit more of a private sector problem. I think they're doing what they can to spur investment and innovation. The DOE has been very aggressive at promoting this. So as part of the DOE program for renewable energy, they introduced, I think it's an $8 billion amount of funding for what they are calling hydrogen hubs. So we didn't really get to discuss hydrogen a lot, but there's been this thought that hydrogen may be an ideal energy carrier. It's had its waves in the past and is never really fully developed, but in Europe, certainly it's much more developed than we are. And so what the Department of Energy wants to do is establish 7 or 8 main sites of hydrogen production and distribution. It's a bit of a chicken and an egg problem. If you want to promote hydrogen, but you don't have hydrogen filling stations, and you want to promote hydrogen, but you don't have hydrogen vehicles because there's no hydrogen fueling stations, you have to come up with either a distribution plan, or you basically have to build everything out together. So by starting with a hub model, I think that's what they're trying to spur.
And my final question, what are some of your take-home messages that you want to leave with the KevinMD audience?
Yeah, so take-home message is, although a bill like this can appear simple, it's 755 pages, so there is a lot of complexity to this. I think there's a lot of stakeholders on all sides, particularly in medicine. It's not going to be a problem that we wake up one day 5 years from now or 10 years from now and something looks necessarily radically different. I think that our best hope along the way is somewhat incremental change. When you think about how they're looking at this, there's actually graphs where they look at projected climate change and temperature changes, and it's a really slow down curve of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So again, it's not going to be something that's revolutionary. I think for both healthcare and clean energy, it's more of an evolution.